Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. Welcome back to the Farts and Crap Show, where today we have episode 11 of Stick Tips. Hope you guys are doing well, and diving right in. Today we have the Nacon wired compact controller. Now, I first got one of these 2.5 years ago. I have a total of 3 of these now, and these have only been sold, as far as I know, in Europe and Japan. So I did have to pick them up like on eBay, and I think 2 of mine actually came from Canada. But anyway, they aren't sold in the US. Nacon doesn't really stock. It's very weird getting Nacon controllers here, even though they are officially licensed products by Sony. And most of them also work as a PC controller. I have covered one other Nacon controller in a previous episode of Stick Tips, and that was the Nacon asymmetric wireless controller. I still love that one. I still use it a lot. But I've used these way more in the past. However, I've never taken them apart, and I have some nitpicks and I have some praises. First thing that I will say, positive. I'm gonna get most of the positive things out of the way first, and then critique, because that's typically how it goes with controllers, with me at least. I find the things that I like, and then over time, some of the downfalls become more and more glaring. So, first thing I love, the D-pad on this thing feels great. Out of the officially licensed controllers that I have used in the past, I would say this is my second favorite D-pad, probably, for officially licensed PS4 controllers. I don't know if I said PS4 before, but the other thing I will say is the material the shell is made out of on these controllers feels incredible. It's kind of a soft, like ABS plastic in a way. Just kind of feels a little velvety, and it doesn't feel gross when your hands like start to get clammy for like intense gaming sessions and stuff like that. I do love the colors these things come in as well. So around the time when I got the second one, I picked up a color variety pack of grippets, which are the analog stick caps that you see on these controllers, because I wanted a monochrome, like black and gray, traditional like PS1 style controller, and Jade wanted a more colorful. She ended up going with purple and orange on her controller, and also the touchpad has tiny little circle, triangle, squares, and crosses or X's all over it in like a pattern, so style-wise that's very cool. Also, the USB cable, as it connects to the controller, is incredibly sturdy. And I'll get to why I know that here in a minute. But yeah, for this whole teardown, the only tool that you really need is a 3-point Phillips head screwdriver. I would also recommend a prying tool or a guitar pick, because getting the shell apart, getting the 3 pieces of the shell like disconnected from each other, which is the first step, is quite difficult. The clamps, or the clasps, I should say, are quite strong. Or the clips. Yeah, the clips holding it together are quite strong. So, and especially if your controller has never been cleaned thoroughly before, it might take a minute. So, once you actually get the shell off. Looking at it from the back, this is what you'll see, and here's where I'm going to get into some criticisms, and there is a theme going here. The PCB, it was quite dirty. I thought it was just dust that collected at first, but it seems to be leftover solder that was just kind of like not cleaned or just lazily applied. And also there really wasn't a way to keep the wires from the rumble motors out of the way. Another thing to notice on this step is the USB wires going into the PCB. That connection is very, very stubborn. At least it was on this controller. So be careful removing that. I would recommend needle nose tweezers, or even the prying tool that you used earlier, to just kind of try to wedge it out. Because in order to remove the top PCB, you are going to have to do that. And there's one other piece to note before removing this PCB, and I will get to that here in a second. Also, the L2 and R2, you can remove the trigger caps. I don't think it's necessary though, because the back plate, which the black plate that surrounds the shoulder buttons, does actually come off of the front and the back portion of the shell. I didn't know that at this stage, but I actually disassembled 2 of these controllers, and I found that out while disassembling the second. So at this point, if you unscrew all the screws, you should have a total of 6 and 7, so 13. There are 7 screws on the back part of the shell, and there are 7 screws, or 6 screws, between the 2 shoulder buttons and the top PCB. Okay, so before removing the PCB, after you have everything else like kind of pulled out of the way, the top left, that is a smaller ribbon cable that I'm pretty sure it's connecting the touchpad to the main PCB, which is what this is. And on the bottom right there, that row of what are pins, that's what they are, that is actually connecting the main PCB to a second PCB that is underneath this one. I at first didn't expect this to be a 2 PCB setup, but it is. So while you are lifting the main PCB from the secondary one, make sure to not wiggle it too much and try to raise it straight out. This was incredibly difficult because I had to also retract the L2 and R2 because I didn't know that top black plate was actually removable at this stage. You just lift it straight up from this angle and then just kind of slowly like slide it away. Okay, and once you do that, and flip the... oh, right, because the smaller ribbon cable, I didn't see a way to remove it from the main PCB. Like, there was no way to, like, usually there's clasps, like, holding the ribbon cable onto the main PCB, but it didn't seem like there was any sort of clasp on there. So just be careful not to yank it, and just flip it forward without applying pressure to it. And yeah, as you can see, the analog stick caps were quite dirty. The problem here is the mounting putty that I used to make sure the grip it analog stick caps stayed on the analog stick, or the analog stick covers stayed on the analog stick caps. It got too warm, and when it does that over enough time, it kind of breaks down and it becomes very stringy and very sticky and hard to remove. I tried soap, toothpaste, hydrogen peroxide, all under like with hot water with like abrasion and like soaking, and all these methods and like the different like cleaning like scrubbers and like brushes and cloths and things that I use, like nothing could remove the residue. And after like the second cleaning, I found that the plastic was actually starting to warp because it's not heat resistant at all. So these actually had to be thrown away, and I was very surprised by that because I've cleaned other analog stick caps before in like hot water and like usually just like toothpaste with like an extra like toothbrush, and just like getting like finer points like that just to get like a nice like shine, make sure it gets super clean, or you know, whatever you use, whatever you have on hand. And I've never seen like actual warping like that before on analog stick caps. So yeah, not very good plastic here. And PCB seemed to be kind of all over the place. I didn't know why there was like so much like labeling and all this stuff on the PCB. It just seemed like completely unnecessary, and I haven't seen this in another controller before. Also, the conductive rubber for the face buttons, incredibly simple. It was at least like held in place by like little pegs, so it's not going anywhere at least, but just there was nothing impressive here to speak of, except the PCB under the main PCB that I mentioned before. I was completely taken aback by that, and there were a few more screws, and what I was hoping for was an isolated D-pad, kind of like what I saw in the PDP Afterglow Wii U Pro controller, or something like that. That would have explained why the D-pad felt so good. And I'll get to that, more of that in a second. And was there anything else I wanted to mention at this point? Nope. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so because the analog stick caps need to be thrown away, I looked around for another controller I could destroy for the analog stick caps, and I found this PDP Rock Candy Xbox 360 controller that has been on my shelf for about a year. And so I went ahead and quickly disassembled this thing because it's been used probably a total of like 3 hours of gameplay. It's not great, but it was one of the only commercially available Xbox 360 controllers about a year ago, so at least in my immediate area. And those analog stick caps did not fit. So I grabbed my original Nacon wired compact controller because it's the same model, and this one has like not been used in probably 2 years because the analog sticks are incredibly worn, and so they have these giant dead zones and are just not accurate because like the left, I believe, side on the left stick is more loose than the other axes, and it's just not good. These analog stick units they just wear out, like, really easily. We still have 3 of these controllers, but I had 4 at one point, and every single one has had kind of the same underlying problems. And this is partially because they cheaped out on certain materials, and partially because of just questionable design choices. So a few things I wanted to point out about this extra controller is the analog stick caps were quite clean, which is good. I'm pretty meticulous about that sort of thing. And the pegs on the analog sticks, where the caps actually sit, are super tiny. They're just really fine, which is why the Rock Candy controller analog stick caps didn't fit, because they were more of a standard size that you would see on pretty much any other modern controller. Another thing to notice is that module that the arrow is pointing to there, that is basically a mechanical switch for the L1 and R1 inputs. Usually that would be a great thing. But the way that these L1 and R1 buttons are designed is so bad, because there are the plastic part that your finger actually touches to hit the L1 and R1 buttons. It's just kind of sitting right on top. There's nothing like holding it in place, and it's kind of just like glued to the PCB in a way, or soldered, I don't know. And I actually had a commenter like about 2 years ago leave a comment, and they were like, hey, I have one of these controllers, and again, I'm paraphrasing, and whenever I have to like hold L1 or R1, I have to press it really hard, or else it doesn't like stay held. And yeah, they do. They are nice for a little like click, but they do not like, they're kind of one of these kind of actions. If you can hear this, which I'm gonna hold it up to the microphone so you guys can hear it. Yeah, it's kind of that kind of thing. It's very clicky, it feels good, but it just doesn't register when you hold it for a while. So that's unfortunate. And okay, that's all I wanted to point out here. And after getting the secondary PCB off of the blue controller, because I was trying to limit, as you can see, it's still on the orange one, and I was kind of afraid stuff would start falling apart, which it kind of did after taking the bottom one off. The D-pad was nothing special. The mold was pretty standard for a PlayStation style controller. Again, a bunch of stuff is labeled for no reason, like up, down, left, right, like why? And but it is kind of isolated on its own PCB. The only thing it shares is the light bar indicator and the PlayStation button itself. So that's kind of great, but then you have all these pins that have to go into the other PCB. So couldn't they just have shared a PCB? Would it been a lot easier? Would have been less manufacturing mistakes? I don't know. Oh, also the share button, which is that portion to the top right of the D-pad indicators. And after getting the newer analog stick caps that were less worn back onto the analog stick pegs, and getting kind of everything cleaned up, I kind of just went over everything with a brush and compressed air, a little bit of the hydrogen peroxide on the brush. I think, yeah. Mostly just for the edges where there was a lot of gunk built up in the shell, it was time to put everything back together again. So I kind of just followed all the steps in reverse, and I wasn't going to worry about putting the blue controller back together because the analog sticks on that thing are worthless, and they've just been abused way too much. So I just kind of salvaged that controller for parts and went ahead with the rest of the process. And after getting the two PCBs back together and making sure everything was kind of in place, I noticed the main PCB was sitting quite high, like pretty far away from the actual front shell. So if everything seems to be, if you are following this as a step-by-step tutorial, if everything seems right except for this one point, don't worry about it. Everything should go back together just fine. It just sits high. It's because of that separating plate housing the L1, R1, L2, R2 shoulder buttons, which I do love that they gave it some space to breathe on this controller, but I hate the way that they implemented the L1 and R1. The mechanical switches feel good to press, but again, aside from a quick click, they don't register very well at all. So sometimes they miss inputs, and if you're trying to hold the button, it just doesn't stay held sometimes. So, and this is after putting everything back together again, making sure things were cleaned again, giving it a final blast of compressed air, and making sure the rumble motors were back in place while the cables were kind of out of the way of everything, hopefully. And again, I just gave it an extra kind of like just a little squeeze to make sure the pins connecting the two PCBs were actually like sitting correctly together. And then after getting the shells back and everything screwed back in with all the screws in place, it was a success. It worked. And I'd give those analog sticks a couple months to go until they are completely useless. So that's kind of the takeaway here, guys. Because if this was a cheaper controller, I could recommend it. If it was like, I don't know, like 20 bucks, I guess. I would say it's fine for like a Player 2 controller, and it has more of the inputs than something like the Hori mini wired gamepad. But the analog sticks on any Hori controller, and specifically the Hori mini wired gamepad, are much higher quality than this controller, the Nacon wired compact controller. I mean, this controller does have the headphone jack. Well, the combo, it's a headset jack, really. It does have the touchpad. It does have a light bar. But the quality of the components are so bad. And also as a final note, Hori, if you do want a wireless version, Hori does have one. I think it's a Japan exclusive. But it's I believe it's called the Hori Wireless Controller Lite. PS4. I ended up getting one off of, I think again it was eBay or PlayAsia. I think it was PlayAsia. And usually you can find one for about 40, maybe 50, depending on how much you have to pay for shipping. And sometimes you can find one on Amazon now. But yeah, consistently you can find the PS4 mini wired gamepad from Hori for less than 30 bucks. And I would highly recommend that over this one. Yes, it's just called the Wireless Controller Lite for PS4. It is wireless, so a little extra latency. It is about $43. Oh wow, but you pay $40 in shipping. Okay, so maybe not go through Amazon, probably eBay or something like that. And the analog stick caps are a little bit better on the mini wired gamepad, on the wireless controller Lite. And they kind of updated a few things over the mini wired gamepad. But I would say just go for the mini wired gamepad. It's, for a budget Player 2 controller, it's much better. Like, much better. But, and the D-pad is actually the other officially licensed controller PS4 D-pad that I like better than the Nacon one, because Hori D-pads are just really good. So anyway, that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Thank you for stopping by. Let me know if you guys have a recommendation for a future Stick Tips episode. I kind of have most of them already picked out, but I'm always down for suggestions. So, have a beautiful day, and many blessings on your journey, whatever it might be. And until next time, take care.